I'd like to welcome everyone to this talk. I'm hoping that it's more fun for a project management or a methods kind of talk. That's at least my intention for it. I did this presentation a few years ago when I was starting to get active, or even more active, in the Agile methods. And I'm a self-reflective individual kind of by nature, so I think a lot about what I used to do and what I'm currently doing and what works and what doesn't work. And I'm almost a geek in that way, that I'm constantly thinking about what's working for me and what's not, what the best practices or good practices are, and what context. And this presentation sort of surfaces from that, in that observing the Agile methods and then looking at, what did I do 15 years ago, and why did people even put up with that, in that it was so wrong, but they tolerated me 15 years ago in my project management patterns and in my practices. So please, go along for the ride here. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's intended to be fun, but it also has a serious message, in that I think we sometimes get our levels off, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So we should wrap up well on time, and hopefully I get to some questions at the end. So given that, the goals for this talk, given that estimating, planning, and tracking are hard, and I think they are hard, independent of methodology, businesses are challenged, and the real answer is it depends on your context. Then what I want to do in this talk is kind of sensitize you to that your planning level, quote-unquote, matters, and it influences your overall effectiveness. I want to share some Agile options or thinking. For those of you who are familiar with the Agile methods, then you're going to get a snippet of each one of them, but at the end I'm going to kind of mine from them what I think are level-setting practices that I find that are valuable and reminders for me. I want to convince you to engage your teams at all levels. So really to kind of internalize some of these practices as you move forward. So the outline, many factors affect our planning level. I want to kind of sensitize you to, or I want to bring them up. Attributes of planning too low and too high. I want to kind of talk about the endpoints of that dimension. And then I want to kind of talk about just right, what just right looks like. I want to mine a few lessons from XP, from Scrum, and from my Endgames book. Really, I just want to kind of get some themes from this. So mine it for common themes. And what does just right look like when it comes to managing software projects and managing your projects? We'll have some conclusions, and then we'll get into, hopefully have some time, or I'm sure we'll have some time for some Q&A. So too high, too low, and assessing which. Let's start. Factors that influence your planning level. I actually think as a starter for this discussion that it's important for all of us to kind of reflect back in different jobs, in different projects, in different teams. Like, what's the level that we're planning at? What's the level that we're interacting with our teams at in general? And what are the factors that influence that? So here's just a list of, it's not exhaustive, but a list of some factors. Experience of your team and the skill set of the team. And your planning and management, those are factors. The general experience level. The size of your team, I think, matters. Is it distributed in nature? Different cultures, geographies? Is it contract versus permanent? What's the mix? Funding limitations, culture, all of these things. And finally, with no real joke, who's breathing down your neck? What's the intensity associated with the project? There's a lot of factors that influence us as managers or leaders or project managers to kind of, at what level that we're interacting with our team. So it's a tough landscape, and it's a challenging landscape, and that's sort of the point that I'm trying to get at here. Characteristics. Let's look at the dimensions. Let's look at the boundary conditions. So characteristics of planning at too low a level. So the trees. Let's call it the trees. You spend a lot of time planning, a tremendous amount of time actually. You try to capture exact requirements. You're doing exhaustive risk analysis. You're looking at historical data, back in history times 250 projects. You're looking at small tasks, less than one day. You're looking at hour granularity tasks. You have mini milestones that are less than 2 and 3 days duration. Or, these are just characteristics. You're down in the weeds. You're not even at the trees. You're in the weeds. You're in the grass. You overreact. If something happens, negatively, you're in deep analysis. I would border it on maybe feeling like analysis paralysis to some degree. So I think there's a place at the boundary of too low where we're constantly looking at the details. And I'm not implying that all details are bad, but this is where we spend the majority of our time. Other characteristics at tracking at too low a level, status reports, daily updates. And for those of you doing daily status reports, or what, please, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just giving you a flavor for what too low looks like. So there's no judgment in this presentation, and but again, giving you a flavor, giving you a nuance of being in the weeds generally to some degree. You overly react to daily changes. There's a normal, in my experience, there's a normal ebb and flow to projects. There's natural risk, there's natural tension, there's natural. Software. There's an ambiguity in all software projects. There's a tremendous amount of unknowns, particularly early on. You're going to have explosions. You're going to have someone being frustrated. You're going to have, discovery and then frustration and then further discovery. So there's that natural ebb and flow. You don't have to necessarily try to capture and control or manage each one of those. Updating task information from everyone. There's successive action tracking, depending on in daily meetings. You might be, I've seen project managers that wander around every day. It's project management by walking around. You're walking to each, to cubes 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. Are you done yet? Are you done yet? Are you done yet? And I'm laughing, and it's tongue in cheek, but I'm not. I've actually seen folks who are really, their heart's in the right place, but they're clearly tracking at too low a level, and they need to, the way I think of it, they need to perhaps bump up a little bit. Imagery. I like imagery to set these boundaries. This is one from my experience. More than a few years ago, I was working at a trading systems company that was acquired by a Japanese parent, and I had the opportunity to go to Japan and view some of our parent development teams there on several visits. And I noticed, and I don't know if this is typical today, but at the time there was a large room, and just picture this in your mind, and there were 2 long rows of connected desk space, and developers were facing one another. And the manager was at the head of the table. I almost pictured a baton in his hand where he was, rapping on the desk in the morning and rapping at night, even though he didn't really have that baton. And he was orchestrating the programming of that team. And team members really didn't have, they weren't self-directed in any way. They were really waiting for the manager to give them approval for the work. There'd be a nod of the head. I remember at least in this culture, it was almost like a game of chicken to see who would leave, because the first person that would leave at the end of the day, was almost a sign of weakness, and then people would be checking each other's eyes, and eventually, everyone would kind of migrate towards the door. But you didn't want to be the first one out. You really wanted to be quote-unquote committed. And you wanted the manager to realize your commitment level. So that's that sort of imagery. Every action, every nuance is sort of managed and controlled by that conductor. That to me is kind of indicative of that in the trees kind of syndrome. Potential problems with that. Again, it's not all bad, and in some cases I can imagine contexts where you do want to be strongly connected to the details, but I imagine a whole raft of contexts where that is inappropriate, and it's not really driving you to the results that you want. So you're managing the details, but are you going to be successful? That's what I always worry about. Could you be missing critical parts of the big picture? And I would argue yes, you probably are. You might be missing the important bits because you're looking at all bits of the project as being perhaps equally important or of equal priority. And in my experience, they're not. Probably 20% of the project bits, the tasks, the issues, the impediments are really those critical things that are impeding you from being successful. And you're not making that distinction. You're not differentiating. You get a false sense of security. If you run around enough, if you talk to enough people, if you look in their eyes and you shake them up in their cubes every day, you get this sense of, I'm in control. I have this sense of, control in the project. And change is constant in software projects. So you're not necessarily, it could be a false sense. In fact, the majority of the times it is a false sense of security as you're in the weeds. You're certainly not, one of the things that disturbs me the most is you're really not leveraging, if you go back to that vision point in Japan,